Minister, for your welcome, and it's an honour to be with you in the important discussions that we'll have today. I think in your work that you'll have the experience of being exposed to some of the best of what people can be, but also some of the worst. And in the work that I've been doing in More in Common over the last few years, I've often wondered about how it is that as people, as societies, we have these two quite different stories that are in a sense always at play around us. One of them sees the world as a place of struggle and competition, where people need a sense of belonging and security, but that often comes from a loyalty to a group that is defined against others, a sort of an us versus them world. A world where we often feel threatened by people who are outsiders to our society or our group, because we think that any gain that someone else has must mean a loss on our part. A world where our side is partly defined by its opposition or its difference from the other side. A world where the deepest part of our humanity is our evolutionary tribal mindset, our sense of our side against others, where we can very easily and frequently find enemies. But on the other hand, there's another story about who we are as people, which is that human impulse that we have to connect, to make connection with others, to transcend differences. And that's a very deep human impulse as well, that sits alongside the tribal impulse, which is part of who we are. It's a world where our deepest experiences in life often come from the surprising connection across our differences, finding commonality where that commonality might not be obvious, transcending divisions that seem to be entrenched. That's a world where we see the deepest sense of pride often in those moments, in moments of being welcomed, in moments of being welcomers, of showing hospitality, welcoming others. We know that that's who we are at our best because it's the values that we so often want to see in our children. It's the legacy we want to leave for the next generation. But the odd thing is that those are two stories that are kind of always playing out side by side. And of course, at different points, one story can feel stronger in our societies or in our own lives. Other times, a different story can seem stronger. But when in the work that More in Common has done, we're often trying to understand, how do you elevate that story of inclusion, that story of welcome, that story of connection, against the story of polarisation and division and tribalism. I saw this at play in a very dramatic, tragic, but still powerful way after the death of Jo Cox, a very dear friend of mine who's a member of Parliament, the British Parliament, back in 2016. As Terry mentioned, I grew up in Australia. I spent a few years after working in politics. I spent a few years in New York and then in the UK. And it was only about 12 or 18 months after I'd come to the UK that Jo had become, by that point, the Member of Parliament who I knew best. Being in the sort of senior political role, I had lots of political connections with people in different parties, but especially the Labor Party, which is the party I'd worked with in Australia. And so when Jo was murdered, brutally in her own constituency, out of the blue, by a guy who had been radicalised online, who'd actually shown no public dysfunction, nobody knew any of his political beliefs, a little bit similar to the assassin or attempted assassin on the weekend in Pennsylvania. But when that happened, the country was thrown into this tremendous sense of shock because political violence is not something that has been normal on British soil against members of Parliament. But it was an immense shock for me because this was somebody who was so close to me and had been a good friend, a champion of a number of different initiatives that I'd been involved with. The day after Jo's murder, I was with a small group of her friends, and we were obviously in shock. But there was this moment when we realised about 3 o'clock that afternoon, what would Jo have us do in this moment? 5 of us, in tears and in shock and kind of moping around there. And we all realised simultaneously, Jo at this moment would absolutely try to turn the story around. Moment of tragedy, sure, but how does this become a story of triumph? And we thought about how it was really important that the story didn't become about the killer, but it became about the values that Jo stood for and why those values were such an inspiration. And so out of that, we, an hour later, started a crowdfunding effort that was to raise money for the causes that Jo stood for. It was including refugees, including community development, inclusion. She represented a very diverse constituency in West Yorkshire. And within a day we had £1 million. Within a couple of weeks we had £2 million. We started the Jo Cox Foundation, and it was out of that More in Common also started. But what was interesting, just in the 5-7 days after that, we did a big event in Trafalgar Square. Thousands of people came. Malala came and spoke. I'd been involved with the White Helmets in Syria, the rescue squads. We had the head of the White Helmets flew out of Syria in honour of Jo, put a white helmet on the stage in her memory. It was some very powerful moments. We even had Elton John volunteering to write a song, but we drew a line there. He said, we're not, that's just too much. But it was a moment where the story that emerged from that was actually a story that really honoured her values. And I have, in subsequent years, I still encounter people who say, this is such a strange thing, that the way in which that terrible death of that young Member of Parliament seemed to sort of change, the story changed. And a lot of work's been done by the Jo Cox Foundation, for example, to encourage women to get into politics, knowing that this increase in violence is a real threat to women in particular who get so much of the online abuse and hatred and the threat of physical violence. But it's a story of how you can something can be turned around. Tragedy can turn to something good, and something enduring has been built in Jo's honour with the Jo Cox Foundation, but also More in Common's work, very much inspired by her. And the name More in Common is from her first speech in Parliament, where she talked about us having more in common than what divides us. And so one of the things that we've wrestled with out of that kind of Genesis story is just how do we make that story of welcome and inclusion a stronger story than the story of division and polarisation. So I want to share a few reflections on that, just 5 key thoughts about how do we transcend tribalism and how do we build on the kind of work that many of you are doing at the local level. And what's the science? What is the science that points to what's most effective? Now we'll kick off with the presentation, if I can get this working. Yeah. So I want to say just 3 things about the challenging environment that really sort of frames the work that each of us is doing. The first is just to say that immigration is a difficult issue all around the world. So the challenges that Ireland has are not unusual. Here's 4 countries where we ask the question, how would you say your government currently manages immigration? And the answer is poorly for about 3/4 of people. In Germany, in Spain and in France there. We just asked the question as well in the United States in the last couple of weeks. We've got similar numbers, actually slightly worse. New government in Poland, so the Polish government rates slightly better, but still 50% saying poorly. That is, the challenge right now is that immigration around the world is high salience, and when immigration is in the news, it's generally a bad thing. It's generally because something's going wrong. And in fact, when you look at, SB's done a very good report on Irish attitudes to refugees and immigration that came out a couple of months ago. And while I'm well aware, and you're far more aware than I am of the very significant challenges in the last couple of years, Ireland still is towards the better end of the spectrum compared to other countries in Europe and elsewhere. A little bit similar to, we haven't ever conducted research in Ireland, but I've been to, in various contexts where talking about the experience here. And Spain is probably the other country that I think of as being quite similar. So it's not to minimise the challenges you have, but it's just to say, actually, you've got some assets that many other countries don't have in terms of the level of community concern, while higher than it has been in the past, actually is not as severe as it is in countries like France, the United States, for example. See if I can master this. The second point, though, which is an interesting finding, what drives this anxiety about immigration is particularly where people see disorder, where they see people sleeping rough, for example, which I know is a very current issue here in this city. It's a very big issue in New York and in Denver and in Chicago and other cities in the United States more recently, and it's the key thing that's driving the dissatisfaction with the Biden administration's handling of immigration at the moment. But it's the southern border in the United States, it's small boats in the UK, it takes different form in different countries, but it's the same sort of story where people see disorder makes them anxious. But why this is important is often when there's opposition and there's criticism of governments, people perceive that maybe this is a hostility towards the migrants themselves. And this is some evidence that really that's often a misinterpretation, that a lot of the concern is about order rather than just about the people themselves, migrants. So we asked this question of, what would you like? Government having control of immigration, or reducing immigration, or increasing immigration? This is in the US, UK and Germany. And the numbers are very clear that about 60% of people say it's having control over who enters the country is the most important thing, so 6 out of 10. It's about 3 out of 10 saying reducing immigration, about 1 out of 10 wants to increase immigration. And it's remarkably similar in those countries. What the lesson out of this is that the public wants to feel like a government's in control. When it sees chaos and disorder, it's particularly what it reacts to. And obviously that's very relevant to the very difficult context of the last few years here in Ireland. But I think it's a useful understanding that dimension helps us to think about how we respond to reduced community anxiety. That it's a lot to do with people having a sense of that there's a system, that there's proper processes, those proper processes are fair, and of course doing that when you have very significant increases in numbers of arrivals is genuinely really difficult, but that's the challenge. A dimension of that is that when you have lots of people arriving, then this scarcity mindset can quickly kick in, and this is one insight. So this is a question here where we've asked in Germany, with agreement with the statement that immigrants are prioritised over natives when it comes to benefits and public services. And you can see here 60% of Germans, there's been a real shift in public attitudes in Germany in the last couple of years. And this is where it translates where there is a sense of scarcity of resources, and I know that there's a very current issue around housing in particular, but this is an aspect that kicks in very quickly. So those are challenges, those 5 things I want to mention as challenges. What are the solutions to that, and what works in terms of good practices for community engagement and for welcoming? Well, one lens that we use in our work is around how do you engage community. And this is one thing I'd like to say, some of you know this very well from being in the volunteer sector, but there is tremendous goodwill to tap into in the community. So we did this study recently in the United States showing that more than 50 million American adults would be keen to take part in sponsorship of refugees in some form of welcoming. Now that doesn't mean everybody welcoming them into their own homes. Typically we find about 10 to 12% of people say they'd be interested in hosting directly, but a lot more, whether it's giving money or driving kids to medical appointments or helping with language classes or something like that. People want to take part, and this is the upside of the fact that immigration and refugees are a much more salient issue, a high-profile issue, which, as I mentioned before, generally that's a bad thing because it means communities frustrated and angry. But the increased salience means that more people want to help out. Now, the challenge is how to do that, and that'll be part of the conversation for today, and many of you have more expertise than I do in this. But we've been doing quite a lot of work to understand, particularly in the US, how do you tap into that 26 million, which is, 26% of the population. We found we asked the question in the UK last year, it was 23%. So again, quite similar, and that's why I feel pretty confident in sharing all of these insights in other Western countries, because most countries are reasonably similar around this. But the challenge is building the systems that are user-friendly and that give the easy way in for people who are interested in taking part. And that's about good design. Many of the ways in which having worked on refugee sponsorship for the last several years, many of the ways in which the programs get set up are not very friendly to somebody who, has a good intention, but maybe doesn't know exactly what the way in might be. So making that easy, small steps, making it easy for somebody to do a little, not demanding too much. We asked the question, what would stop you in the US? And the number one concern was, well, I'm worried that I'd be committing way too much money, more money than I have. And the second one was, I don't think I have the expertise. And one of the interesting things we found with people in their 20s getting involved was that they realised once they participated in a sponsorship group, that being in your 20s, you're likely to be a lot more digitally savvy than people in older age groups. And that's a real asset when somebody comes into the community and needs help to navigate all the different sort of parts of life, navigate different services. And one of the things that came out of the research we did with the people in their 20s was, I realised that I have something to offer that I never realised I did before. And that's one of the experiences of being part of welcoming, is that there are things that you can do that you never imagined. Telling that story of welcoming, not just the story of the welcomed, not just the story of the outsider coming in, but the stories of the people who are the volunteers who are taking part, is a really important part of tapping into that energy and that interest. A second part of this is understanding that people have different starting points. So if you want to engage more people, if you want to turn down community anxiety, you need to start where people are at and not start just from your own values and perspective. This is particularly important in the area of immigration, the kind of us versus them, the social psychology of this. And this is a complex area of work that we do, but we've mapped this in all the countries in which More in Common works. I've got names here from the way we segment people in the United States. But this is using John Haidt's work on moral foundations. And the moral foundations is like our moral taste buds. It's like how we experience the world, what we see as right and wrong. And there are 5 moral taste buds that he talks about: authority, care, fairness, loyalty, and purity. And what's important about this is that this is showing 7 different tribes, as it's a sort of left to right, but it's not really, those middle groups are not really defined by left-right politics. But what's interesting here is that on the left here, the progressive activists and traditional liberals are different in being very weak on some values. The conservatives are actually pretty strong on all of those values. Now, what is this actually saying? It's saying that care and welcome are pretty universally shared values, but the difference between people who often dominate in the kind of welcoming, the refugee sector, the immigrant rights sector, they're typically more the progressives. They're actually really weak on a couple of value sets, particularly authority, that is, thinking that it's important there are rules that everybody follows, believing in sort of order. And so they sort of devalue or don't see that as important in the way that many other people in society do. So it just makes them less attuned to the way that other people in society perceive the importance of rules being followed. So crossing borders, people crossing borders, many of us might say, well, people are people and that's more important than the borders. But for others, and for the majority of people actually in our societies, those things are really important. And orderly systems, having a queue, having a sense of a line, people not jumping into that line ahead of others, that's really important as a moral value. And this work has been really important because we've done training, for example, with UNHCR staff, the UN Refugee Agency, and we've found that overwhelmingly, kind of 9 out of 10, are in 1 or 2 of those 6 or 7 groups. So their starting point is they just don't and even their social networks tend to be people quite like them. So overcoming that and understanding other people have different starting points is really important to engage in this conversation, because people feel threatened by difference. A third principle in terms of good practices is promoting shared identity. I want to just tell you a story of Freital, a town in Saxony, the old East Germany, where there was a lot of neo-Nazi activity. There'd been new arrivals, particularly from Syria, in an area that really hadn't had a lot of people with migrant backgrounds. And there was an effort among the community organisations in Freital to try to mobilise people for a more positive reception, for a more positive story around the recently arrived Syrians. But they were really struggling to get others to take part in that initiative. We were part of a consortium that was helping them, and in Freital and a few other places. And there was a really significant breakthrough that changed the dynamics, and that got a much broader range of community organisations on board there. And what it was this, that they had been talking about the importance of the migrants, the refugees, the arrivals, and diversity. But people who'd been hearing that didn't think that involved them. They thought, well, it's something about these other people. It's not my concern. I'm busy, Chamber of Commerce, running business, or I'm, running a sports group, or doing something else. I'm not part of that. But there was this moment where, because there was a shift in the initiative, which was to celebrate more the shared identity of being part of Freital. Freital had this history of being 7 villages kind of squashed together 100 years ago, didn't really have a strong sense of civic identity. So they did all sorts of things to create pride in Freital. They created a community calendar that was distributed all across the 40,000 people in the city, in the town. And they had the faces of all sorts of different characters and leaders in Freital. Now, a couple of those, month by month they had different faces. A couple of those were faces of newly arrived people. But they were integrated, mixed in with the head of the fire brigade, a head teacher at a school, just different leaders. And what they were promoting was a sense of community, the whole of community. And there's this moment in a meeting where one of the leaders of the groups that had refused to take part, he stood up and he said, I've been listening to this and I just realised that diversity includes us. Includes people like me who've lived here all our lives. And we want to be on board with that. And the shift was going from focusing on otherness to focusing on the usness, but not an us that's against them, but an us that's big and inclusive. So finding whatever those sources of common identity that tell a bigger story of us can be really powerful. The point of integration is really powerful when you see how much it can shift people's attitudes. And this is why, at the community level, finding ways to help integration really is worthwhile. This is a finding from recent work that we did a few months ago in Germany. Now, on the left-hand side there, we asked a question about deportation. 87% of Germans say there should be more deportations of people who have got no legal right to remain in Germany. So you'd say, 9 out of 10, that sounds very hostile towards outsiders. But on the other hand, simultaneously, same study, another question, we asked them, were people with no legal right to remain in Germany, but they are actually, if these people are well integrated, they're in work or in informal training, should they be allowed to stay? And 82% of people say yes. So it would seem to be a contrast, 9 out of 10 saying we need more deportations of people with no right to remain, but actually if they're integrated, no, they should be able to stay. And this is because most people are not immigration lawyers, they're not technical experts, they're responding at a kind of heart level, but when they see integration, when they see people working, they're contributing, they're part of the community, then they're okay with them. Even people who are often quite anxious and quite fearful. And that says a lot about what work should we be doing if we can design policies and if we can execute policies and do work that shows integration, where people can see that that mix is working, that people who've come from outside are becoming part of the community, contributing, that big story of us. It really shifts public perception because the public's very malleable on the perceptions of outsiders and insiders. That's probably one of the most important findings from all of the work that we've done across different countries. The last thing I want to mention is it relates to sponsorship. And this is specifically refugee sponsorship is involved in doing, but I think the principles apply more broadly to all forms of community-based welcome. You can really shift positively people's perception when you have more community engagement in the welcoming of outsiders coming in. If the public more generally sees that this is being led by local communities, they're more confident. So this is an example of this where we asked the question about people's support or opposition to welcoming more refugees. And there's this is in the UK. The overall position was opposition. It was slightly ahead of support, but when we framed it through the lens of refugees coming in through sponsorship, there was we went from a -3 gap to a 23-point gap in support. That is 55 to 32% support of welcoming refugees. So there can be a really significant shift in favour of welcoming as a country when that's being done through the local level. And why? Because it's more orderly, usually. I mean, recognising that there are some very particular challenges that many of you have experienced more recently. But in general, that community-led effort is seen as being more orderly. It results in better integration, better acquisition of language, breaking down those us versus them dynamics. It brings people together. It's a really interesting thing that when we helped the State Department name the US Welcome Corps refugee sponsorship program that got launched last year. And the tag that they adopted that came out of our research was, so it's called Welcome Corps, welcoming refugees, sponsoring refugees, strengthening communities. So that second piece, strengthening communities, was a really important finding in the research, that people sense their ability to make a difference when they, in their local community, when they come together as part of the welcoming effort. And people who often feel that their community is not functioning very well, when they see that collaboration, there's a project that people are taking part in, just as it can be true of cleaning up a local creek, but welcoming families in, helping them into school, helping them to services at that local level has a very positive spin-off effect in how people perceive their own community. You can tap into different sources of identity, so faith groups, churches play an important role, student groups, universities, women's groups, LGBT affinity groups. There are different ways of doing it, but those affinity groups can be strengthened when they're involved in welcoming outsiders. Another really important thing is you create new champions who have stories that are powerful stories, and we're in an era where professionals, politicians, NGO leaders, even celebrities are trusted much less than what they used to be. The most trusted person is someone who just looks like an ordinary, everyday citizen, an authentic local person, a nurse, a teacher, a doctor, just universally more trusted. And sponsorship and welcome activities allows you to elevate those stories from people who can inspire trust like that. So if we can, I don't know if we can get this to work, but this is an example of someone in Ohio who voiced exactly this kind of sense of the wonderful experience of being part of being welcoming.
For me, the feeling of actually seeing something that I did in action come to fruition. I mean, you actually see it and you can make it happen. Because a lot of times you just do this stuff, send it out, do that, don't know where it goes, don't know how it helps, see that helping. So the family themselves have been extremely gracious, which is also rewarding. But there's times when I actually feel so filled up with joy about the experience that I have not experienced with anything else that I could imagine. And it's like, I'm not quite sure why that is. But I think it's because of that sense of actually accomplishing something and watching it happen and grow.
There's one thing that we've found that's been really surprising is about middle-aged men, sort of middle to late-aged men, who are often not very interested, like there's a demographic group not so interested in sort of welcoming activities. They get involved because their spouse or a friend gets them involved and says, can you paint an apartment, or can you drive someone to lessons or something like that. But one aspect of how you get change in people's attitudes and behaviour is we often assume that people need an argument first and then they do something different. But particularly for that group, sort of middle, later age men, they actually need to do something first and then their ideas change. So the change in attitude actually follows being asked to do something. Because they do something, they get affirmed by others in their community. This is great, thank you for doing this. They get positive feedback. They feel that they can be part of something useful. And then they start to see themselves as welcomers. And we've heard that in a number of different focus groups we've conducted with welcomers. And I think it's something really interesting that there are different pathways in for people to participate in welcome. It's not going to always be the same way. But it's incredibly powerful when people have these positive experiences and they start talking. And that's an age group, that's a demographic of people who really talk. So they'll talk to their friends, they'll talk to their friends of friends, and that then becomes something which can widen that pool of community builders. So there's a starting point.